Thank you very much indeed, Amy. A big thank you to Amy for introducing this event today. I'm reminded today, of course, that the Scottish Youth Parliament came into existence one day before the Scottish Parliament and has always been really integral to the devolution process. So it is very appropriate to have its chair open this event today. Thank you also to all of you for coming along here today. For those of us who were actively involved at the time, it is really quite hard to believe, but it is, of course, 20 years ago to the very day that the people of Scotland were casting their votes on whether or not to establish a new Scottish Parliament. And it's quite easy, I think, looking back now, to assume that the outcome of the referendum was inevitable. But that's not how it felt at the time. My abiding memory of the day, apart from the fact that it was raining, I think, my abiding memory of the day was feeling very nervous about the outcome. So although we think it was an inevitability as we look back on it, the result then wasn't taken for granted. Because the referendum that day was the result of decades of campaigning. It brought to a point of decision a journey that had had many ups and downs and many false starts along the way. It was the intensity of the campaign in the 1980s and the 1990s, following on from the disappointment of the 1979 referendum, an event that I don't clearly remember, I hasten to add, that led directly to the establishment of the Parliament at Holyrood. The election of Margaret Thatcher, followed by 18 years of Tory government that people in Scotland consistently rejected, were undoubtedly major factors in the event that led to the referendum. But the demand for some form of Scottish self-government long predated the Thatcher premiership, and when considered in the sweep of history, was and remains far more deep-rooted and far more fundamental than just a reaction against an unpopular government. Of course, famously in 1707, Chancellor Seafield brought the old Scottish Parliament to a close with these words, "Now there's an end of an old sang." But the signing of the Act of Union didn't just mean the end of an old song. It was also the start of a new story, a story of the new relationship with our friends and neighbours in these islands. And as Westminster parliamentary democracy took hold, so too did a long-running Home Rule story. It was, though, in the post-war era that politicians from different political traditions worked with renewed vigour to re-energise the Home Rule cause. Notably, from the early SNP, there was John McCormack, and later his idea of a Scottish Covenant Association to campaign across the country and across different parties for a devolved Parliament. And from Labour, at a time when devolution was opposed by the party leadership, John P. Mackintosh. Indeed, there is a quotation from Mackintosh at the entrance to the Donald Dewar reading room in the Scottish Parliament, taken from a speech he gave to the House of Commons in 1976. And it says this: "People in Scotland want a degree of government for themselves. It's not beyond the wit of man to devise the institutions to meet those demands." And 20 years after those words were spoken, in 1997, politicians and activists from the SNP, Labour, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, from other parties and from none, campaigned together to win just such an institution, the Parliament that sits in Edinburgh at Holyrood today. And one of the things that marked out that campaign 20 years ago, in some ways similar to the independence referendum of 2014, was the involvement of many beyond party politics. The churches, trade unions, writers, artists, business people all had their say and indeed were driving forces in building the momentum that led Labour to promise a referendum and the people to vote for a Parliament with tax-varying powers. Indeed, it was a clergyman, the late Canon Kenyon Wright, who chaired the Constitutional Convention. Kenyon revered the words of the 1989 Claim of Right, which asserted the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs. And that claim that sovereignty lies with the people is a direct counter to the Westminster view of sovereignty lying with Parliament. The Claim of Right was described by Kenyon as a watershed in Scottish democracy, and there is no doubt that it is a document of major historical constitutional significance. So for politicians and non-politicians alike, it was a time of optimism, hope, a time of shared endeavour. Now, competition between political parties is essential for a vibrant democracy. We should always celebrate, not decry, a battle of ideas and robust debate. But what we proved 20 years ago is that even though we disagreed on the final destination, it was still possible to reach a consensus on the direction of our country. 20 years ago, a broad consensus in Scotland was reached on two key points. Firstly, that to satisfy basic democratic principles, decisions about Scotland across a range of policy areas should be taken here, not by governments at Westminster. And second, that by taking decisions in Scotland, the lives of people of this country would be improved. More generally, we reached agreement as a nation that the resources and talent we have in abundance could be put to use to build a better Scotland. So today, on the anniversary of the devolution referendum, I want to assess the key drivers of the campaign 20 years on and ask whether devolution has indeed improved both Scottish democracy and the lives of people who live here. But more importantly, I also want to look forward. It's often been said that devolution is a process, not an event. So I'll argue that by continuing that process and enhancing further the powers of our national parliament, we will not only build upon the Home Rule tradition, but also equip that parliament better for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. And I will argue that even though there is still disagreement, passionate disagreement, about the final destination of our constitutional journey, we should nevertheless seek a new spirit of consensus to match that achieved in 1997. Indeed, I will argue that with Brexit now threatening the underpinning principle of devolution and many of our vital national interests, it is essential that we do so. And in thinking ahead, we should reflect on one key difference between the circumstances of today and those of 20 years ago. Before devolution, because almost all political power rested at London, those looking to achieve or resist change had to look south. There was no choice to do otherwise. Westminster was where the decisions were taken. Back in 1997, the dominant debate was about our place in the UK and our relationship with Westminster. And of course, that is still very much a live debate today. How could it be otherwise when significant power to shape life in Scotland still lies there? But the big difference today is this. After devolution, we were able to look not just south, but all around us, to our fellow European nations and to countries across the globe. And we could contribute our ideas, learn from others, and then put those ideas into practice here in Scotland. Far from narrowing our vision, devolution has widened our horizon. We're represented today through Scottish Government offices in Washington, Beijing, Dublin, Brussels, London, and Toronto, and soon will be in Berlin and Paris as well. Because of the initiative of former First Minister Jack McConnell, we are active in development efforts in Africa. So as we look ahead, the debate we need to have about our future is not just about our place in the UK, it is also about our place in the world. And the political relationship we need to consider is not just that with Westminster, but with the European Union and the wider global community. But firstly, let's assess whether devolution has improved Scottish democracy and the lives of people who live here. There is no doubt, in my view, that the democratic gains of a Scottish Parliament have been substantial. Power has been brought closer to the people. Decisions about Scotland and so many policy areas are now taken by people who live and work here. Our Parliament is more open and accessible than Westminster. Issues that would never, ever have found their way onto a Westminster agenda with little time for Scottish legislation now command priority and attention. The way our MSPs are elected has brought about a new way of carrying out the business of government. The system demands compromise, working together, give and take, to reflect the views and interests of all of the country. Governments and indeed opposition parties do well to remember this reality because it is as true today as it was in 1999. Our voting system has allowed new voices to be heard. It has ensured representation over the years from the Greens, Scottish Socialists and Independents. Our national life has been enhanced by the contribution of individuals like Dennis Canavan and the late Margot MacDonald. And in local government, the days when one party could win virtually every seat on a council on less than half the votes are thankfully gone. That said, I think it's important that we now look again at the way local decisions are taken. That's why the Scottish Government is committed to working with councils to review how local democracy is working. We'll examine how local decisions are made to benefit communities the most and encourage the spread of community participation in budget decisions. However, there is no doubt that big democratic gains were made possible because of the decision taken on this day 20 years ago. Of course, people who voted back in 1997 will have made their decision on what was best, not just for their own generation, but for the generations to come. So it's important to consider the impact of devolution on today's younger generation. What impact has the decision that their parents made 20 years ago had on the lives of today's 16-year-olds, who, of course, have no memory whatsoever of life before a Scottish Parliament? The most obvious democratic gain for a 16-year-old today is that thanks to devolution, he or she can vote. They can help shape the democracy, the kind of country they live in. Today's 16 and 17-year-olds can vote in Holyrood and local government elections, and it's high time, in my view, that they were allowed to vote in UK general elections as well. But it is the impact on young people's daily lives that the benefits of devolution can be seen most clearly. Well, we have challenges in education which we are determined to address. There have also been improvements. A 16-year-old today is part of a school system delivering record higher passes, a 30% increase in the last 10 years alone. If our 16-year-old is from a low-income background, he or she can still apply for an education maintenance allowance to help them stay on at school, something not possible south of the border, and a policy choice only made possible by the yes result of the referendum 20 years ago. And because of the ability to take our own decisions, our 16-year-old can look forward to a university education free from the burden of £9,000 a year tuition fees. If he or she decides not to go to university, they'll be entering a labour market in which youth unemployment is at half the rate it was at the time of the referendum, and now one of the lowest anywhere in Europe. Teenagers today grow up not just in a more prosperous country, but in a safer and healthier country too. Having our own parliament has allowed us to safeguard the founding principles of the NHS. And while, like health services across the globe, ours faces demographic pressures, we have today the best performing emergency services anywhere in the UK. Crime is at a 42-year low. The number of 15-year-olds who smoke has dropped by more than 2/3 in the last decade, the lowest level since surveys began. No doubt, at least in part, because the Scottish Parliament took the decision to lead the way in banning smoking in public places. And of course, last week, the Scottish Government announced further action to tackle obesity, to match the groundbreaking action we've already taken to tackle alcohol misuse, setting out plans to use our own powers to limit the marketing of products high in fat, sugar and salt, even if Westminster decides not to. We're working hard to ensure that our children and teenagers grow up in a Scotland with cleaner air and less pollution. Having our own parliament enabled us to adopt the most ambitious climate change legislation anywhere in the world and set a 100% target for electricity consumption from renewable sources. We're now seeking support from Parliament to go further, boosting cycling and walking, phasing out the need for new petrol and diesel cars by 2032, 8 years ahead of the target set by the UK government. So our Parliament has been characterised by a determination to lead the way, to drive forward equality and tackle discrimination. In many respects, those I've mentioned and many more besides, we have led the way. So what I think this tells us is this: the decisions today's generation make can and will have a profound impact on tomorrow's. Now, of course, some of the policies I've mentioned were brought about by the SNP, others by different parties. Some decisions have been contentious, others, like free personal care, one of the flagship policies of the Scottish Parliament, commanded widespread cross-party support. Of course, it's important to recognise and acknowledge that our Parliament has also made mistakes, and there are areas where people wish progress had been faster and gone further. That's in the nature of democracy. But I think there are few people in Scotland today, even many of those who campaigned for a no vote 20 years ago, who would deny that taking decisions in Scotland has been a good thing. On any reasonable assessment, both Scottish democracy and the life of our nation have been enhanced by that bold democratic step we took together as a country. And that, of course, brings us to the future. If the last 20 years have proven the worth of having a parliament of our own, what will the future hold? Because despite our collective achievements, we have much still to do and overcome. Today's 16-year-olds enjoy advantages previous generations didn't, but in other respects, they face greater challenges. The jobs market is changing. Technology is moving at an extraordinary pace. That can mean greater opportunity, but also greater insecurity. As our population ages, the need not only to support our older citizens, but also to provide fairness across the generations is greater than ever. The gap between rich and poor is still too wide, and social mobility still too narrow. Last week, using the current powers of devolution, I set out the Scottish Government's programme for the coming year. The changes we are proposing are far-reaching. We have examined every area of devolved policy and asked what more can be done to help create the best country we can for young and for old. Given the importance of human rights and the fact that they are so hardwired into the devolution settlement, we've also made clear that we'll oppose vigorously any attempt to undermine the Human Rights Act or withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. We want instead to ensure that Scotland continues to lead by example. And I'm delighted to confirm today that former chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, Professor Alan Miller, has agreed to chair an expert group to give independent advice to the Scottish Government. The group will lead a process with participation at its heart, engaging as many people as possible to make recommendations on how we can protect and enhance economic, social, cultural, environmental and other rights. So there is much we can and much that we are doing, but we should always be restless in our ambition to make life better for the people who live here. And the more powers our Parliament has, the more we can collectively do for Scotland. So today I want to talk about how we can build a new consensus in 2017 to match the spirit of 1997. Respecting our differences and then working together, not as government and opposition, but as equal partners to win more powers for the Parliament and assert and protect the rights of our Parliament. In 1997, the SNP, Labour, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and others had competing views of Scotland's constitutional future. And that is as true today as it was back then, perhaps even more so. Everyone knows, or at least I think they do, that I believe that becoming an independent country would be the best future for Scotland. And that, as I said in June, at the end of the Brexit process, I believe that the people of Scotland should have a choice about our future direction as a country. Indeed, at its heart, independence is the natural extension of the principle that decisions should be taken in Scotland, and that doing so improves the lives of people who live here. Others, of course, disagree completely with that. The key point I'm making here today is this. 20 years ago, that disagreement about the final destination did not stop us from working together to make progress where we could, and it shouldn't stop us today either. We should work today, as we did then, to find and make progress on the areas where agreement does exist. That will take effort and compromise by all of us. So over the coming months, the Scottish Government will play our part. We'll publish a series of evidence-based papers making the case for extending the powers of our Parliament. These papers will cover the issues of employment and employability, social security, immigration and trade. They will not be intended as the final word, but instead to stimulate debate and seek consensus. Today, however, I want to focus on three areas in particular where I believe a new consensus can be built and where the needs of the country demand that it is: on immigration, on our relationship with the European Union, and on social security. And as we consider each of these issues, just as we did 20 years ago, we should think not just about the needs of today, but also about the impact on and our responsibility to the next generation. Let me deal firstly with immigration. Rarely an easy issue for politicians, but one where The needs of our economy, the needs of our society demand honesty and straight talking. 20 years ago, before devolution, the number of people working in Scotland, indeed our overall population, were both projected to fall. Now, to their credit, the Liberal administration of the time recognised that. That's why, for example, the Fresh Talent Initiative was devised. But the real turnaround in Scotland's population came about in large part because of our place in the European Union and the enlargement process. Our economy, society and culture have been enriched by those who have settled here in Scotland. And in turn, people in Scotland today have the right to work and study in 27 other European Union countries. I believe absolutely firmly and passionately that today's 16-year-olds should enjoy that same right in the future, and that they should also continue to benefit from the contribution of their fellow EU citizens who choose to make Scotland their home. Now, today, the UK government celebrates when the number of people coming to Britain falls. They have a target based, as far as I can see, on ideology rather than any rational consideration to cut net inward migration to the tens of thousands. But let's be clear about what that would mean for Scotland, what the very act of trying to reach that target could mean for Scotland. It will place a bigger burden on today's young people. It will raise again the possibility, perhaps the likelihood, of a falling working population. And that in turn would mean skill shortages, fewer jobs and fewer taxpayers to pay for a growing demand for public services. So a debate and a target driven largely by the needs and priorities of other parts of the UK could have devastating consequences for our economy and our society. But under current powers, there is nothing we can do about that. And that is one reason why there is now growing support for Scotland to have flexibility over immigration policy. It would give us the ability to take decisions to suit our needs and protect our economy. And it would also give us the opportunity to stay true to the words of Donald Dewar in his great opening address to the Scottish Parliament in 1999. On that day, the late First Minister said this of Scotland's renewed democracy: "This is about more than our politics and our laws. This is about who we are, how we carry ourselves." Offering a welcoming hand and an open heart to those seeking a better life or to make a contribution here in Scotland will honour that fine sentiment. So on this issue, I believe the prospect of building a Scotland-wide consensus is both necessary and possible. Of course, the question of immigration is bound up with the freedom of movement and our relationship with the European Union. You know, when you look back to the House of Commons debates on devolution in 1997, it is quite noticeable that the question of how Scotland would be represented in Europe was very prominent. The issue then was, post-devolution, who would argue for Scotland's interests in the Council of Ministers. No one back then, absolutely no one, seriously contemplated that in 20 years' time, Scotland would be in danger of not being represented in the European Union at all. But despite voting overwhelmingly to remain within the EU, that is the danger we face today. In all this, it is important to remember that the EU isn't standing still. The single market, already the world's most lucrative marketplace, is still evolving. There will be additional benefits when it is complete. The digital single market, for example, could add hundreds of billions of euros to the European economy. With our world-class universities, our tech businesses, with our resources and our talent, few countries are better placed to take advantage of that than we are here in Scotland. And for today's young generation, that should represent a huge opportunity. And that's one of the reasons that the Scottish Government, notwithstanding our opposition to leaving the EU at all, is so determined to at least maintain our place in the single market. And that's a view shared by the vast majority of the Scottish Parliament and indeed across Scottish society. And the parliamentary arithmetic at Westminster means now that if we are prepared to work together, there is a real possibility of limiting the damage and forcing Theresa May to change course. And in these circumstances, Scottish MPs have real power. They could make the difference. So in Holyrood, all those who oppose an extreme Brexit must first of all come together. And then we must work with our colleagues in the House of Commons to keep Scotland in the single market. That is a consensus in the national interest that we must build and we must make count. The growth of the single market and advances in digital technology are both examples of benefits of a more globalised world. But we also know that global forces, which are only going to increase in scale, can also bring insecurity and inequality. And that reinforces the need for a strong social safety net, a decent social security system that we should all be able to rely on in times of need. And in the coming years, this will be more important than ever for young people growing up in Scotland. But it is a safety net that is sadly already being removed from far too many. From the sanctions regime to the treatment of disabled people to the rape clause, the UK government's approach has caused widespread revulsion. Around £1 billion a year is set to be cut from welfare spending in Scotland by the end of this decade. Now, we can try to mitigate some of the worst of Tory policy, and we have done that. We've invested, for example, over £350 million to mitigate the bedroom tax. We spent more than £120 million to help nearly a 250,000 households through the Scottish Welfare Fund. As part of our drive to tackle poverty, we've also invested more than £1 billion in the last 4 years through the Council Tax Reduction Scheme, helping almost 500,000 households each year to meet their bills. You know, this mitigation poses, I think, real questions about the purpose of a Scottish Parliament. Is a Scottish Parliament there simply to act as a sticking plaster to mitigate bad decisions taken at Westminster? Or should it have the power to take better decisions in the first place in the interests of the people we represent? That latter purpose is surely the reason so many people campaigned for and voted for devolution 20 years ago. So the time has come to build on the limited social security powers the Parliament has, powers which, make no mistake, we will use to deliver better and more humane support for carers, low-income families and those with disabilities, and seek a consensus to ensure that many more decisions about welfare are taken here in Scotland, because that would allow us to protect more people in the short term, but also to contemplate more fundamental reform for the longer term. For example, the option of a citizens' basic income that I spoke about in the Scottish Parliament just last week. For my part, I believe that if we are prepared to put party interest aside in favour of the national interest, it is possible to reach agreement on a cross-party basis to protect and modernise the post-war welfare state. So the opportunity is there now, if we are prepared to put aside our differences and work together, to build a new consensus on our relationship with Europe and on winning the powers to take decisions here in Scotland on immigration and social security. And I think it's really important, not just for those of us today, but for the next generation, that we seek to do so. But it is important for the here and now as well. You know, today I've spoken about the opportunities for enhancing devolution in the future. But the reality is that we face a more urgent task, one that is not so much about enhancing devolution as it is about protecting it. You know, today, ironically, on the very anniversary of the vote to establish a Scottish Parliament, there is an attempt to erode the settlement that the people of Scotland voted for. The EU Withdrawal Bill, which the UK government is attempting to take through the House of Commons today, threatens the very principle on which our Parliament is founded. The devolution settlement, the Scotland Act that established our Parliament, is based on the quite genius principle, when you look back and consider it, that everything is automatically devolved unless it is explicitly reserved. The EU Withdrawal Bill turns that principle absolutely on its head. As it stands, that bill will mean that devolved policy areas, agriculture, fishing, the environment, for example, which are currently carried out at EU level, will be automatically reserved to the Westminster Parliament unless the UK government decides later to devolve them. So Westminster will decide what areas of already devolved policy will actually remain devolved in the future. So on the very day that we should be celebrating devolution, we're also being called upon to defend it. Let's be clear, the people of Scotland voted for the Parliament that now sits at Holyrood. The settlement on which it is based belongs to them. It doesn't belong to this or any other government, Scottish or UK. So that bill must be changed and our Parliament must be protected. And these developments mean that the question facing us today is whether we will continue to go forward in the ways that I have set out or allow ourselves to be taken backwards. We must ask what kind of society we want for today's and future generations. And despite the sound and fury of Scottish politics, on the issues I have outlined today, I believe that there is more that unites us than divides us. The majority of us want to maintain Scotland's reputation as an outward-looking, welcoming nation. We want today's young Scots to have the opportunity to live in an outward-looking, welcoming European nation. We want to be a country that can take advantage of the opportunities a globalised world can offer while protecting our citizens here at home. We are a country that values and promotes democracy, cooperation and solidarity. 20 years ago, we proved that we could put differences aside to build a better democracy, a better economy, and a better society. I think it's time to go forward in that spirit again, not to allow ourselves to be blinded by our disagreements, but to explore, identify, and advance our areas of agreement instead. Our job today is, yes, to protect what we won in 1997, but then also to make sure that we continue to build upon it, both in tribute to those whose efforts over generations delivered our own Scottish Parliament, but also in the best interests of all of those we serve today and into the future. Thank you very much indeed.